Welcome back, everybody. Today, what I would like to do is provide some background information about photosynthesis and remind everybody about the importance of plants from an ecosystem perspective. We will go on tomorrow to look at the molecular level details of the process of photosynthesis itself. So let's get started. Almost all ecosystems are based on the productivity of photoautotrophs. Those are organisms that can capture the energy in sunlight and turn it into biological material. And the majority of the biological productivity is carried out by plants. These organisms harvest energy in sunlight through a process that we know is called photosynthesis. And the entire ecological structure of consumers, all those heterotrophs, is built upon the productivity of plants. So this means that virtually all consumers ultimately get their energy from plants, which are photosynthesizing. So what's exactly is happening during? Well, the overview picture of it that we have is that carbon dioxide and water are converted into glucose and oxygen using light energy. And some of the light energy that hits the plant is stored in the chemical compound called glucose. The overall chemical equation for photosynthesis is water plus carbon dioxide is transformed into glucose plus oxygen. The equation, of course, needs to be balanced, and so it's 6 waters plus 6 carbon dioxides become 1 molecule of glucose, here represented as C6H12O6, and 6 molecules of oxygen. In the photo here, we can see an example of photosynthesis in action. This is the aquatic plant called Elodia, and you can see that oxygen is bubbling out of its leaves when it is placed in bright light because photosynthesis is occurring, producing the waste product of oxygen. Let's get situated in the plant and figure out where photosynthesis takes place. Any part of the plant that's green, which are typically the leaves, is an indication that photosynthesis is occurring there. So if you see green stems or green bark, green anything, photosynthesis is most likely happening there. Now, leaves have a layered structure, as you can see in this middle diagram here. You can see that there's a layer towards the top of the leaf and a layer towards the bottom, and a lot of space for gases to pass through. And why is that? Well, of course, because one of the reactants in photosynthesis is carbon dioxide, and it has to be able to get into the cells in the leaves to become part of the reaction in photosynthesis. Now, the cells contain chloroplasts, and if you actually look carefully in a plant, this upper layer has a more abundant number of chloroplasts than this lower layer. It's not really clear in this diagram. And can you guess why that would occur? Yeah, you probably guessed that the upper surface of the leaf is closer to the light and there's less light getting through to the bottom. So there need to be more chloroplasts. Chloroplasts themselves have a very distinctive structure. They are double membranes and they have these stacks of disc-like green structures called thylakoids, and the stacks are called grana. The singular is granum. The chlorophyll occurs in the thylakoid membrane. It's not just floating around. And this is a theme in biology that when there's important chemistry going on, there may be a membrane present that separates some chemicals to constituents that are going to take part in a reaction from others. And you've already seen how that's true in the mitochondria. Here's another diagram about the location of photosynthesis. We have a leaf cell, we have the chloroplast, we have the grana, and then here's an individual thylakoid. And just as by way of preview, you can see there's a proton pump here, and you can see ATP synthase is here. And we'll talk more about them in tomorrow's video. So if leaves absorb light, why then are plants green? They're absorbing the light energy to create glucose. Well, you'll remember the electromagnetic spectrum: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Different colors of light have different wavelengths and different frequencies, and hence different amounts of energy. The violet end of the spectrum is more energetic than the red end of the spectrum. So plant leaves use molecules called pigments to absorb the light energy, but they can't use or absorb all the colors, and I'm going to show you a graph of that in a second. Plant leaves, specifically the pigments in chloroplasts, absorb all colors except green, which they therefore reflect, and we see the reflected light. And here's what's called an absorption spectrum. And if we shine all the colors on chloroplasts, you can see that these black and white lines represent the amount of the light that's shining that is absorbed. And you can see all the blue light, or almost all the blue light, is absorbed, and all the yellow, orange, and red light is absorbed. But the green and the greenish blue light is not absorbed. So that goes through the leaf or is reflected by the leaf, and that's what we see. Chlorophyll has this amazing ability that when it absorbs light, the pigment becomes energized. So, our overview of photosynthesis so far is as follows. Chlorophyll absorbs light energy from all colors except green. When light is absorbed, an electron in the chlorophyll is raised to a higher energy level. The energy in the excited electron is then used to make ATP, and the ATP can then be used as part of the process to make an organic molecule such as glucose. Of course, the process is more complex than this, as we shall see. But before we go on to that, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and ATP is therefore a modified ribonucleotide. We can see here that it is an adenine base, a 5-carbon ribose sugar, and then 3 phosphates instead of the normal 1 that would be in the nucleotides that are used to make RNA. These 3 phosphate groups, being bonded so closely together, have a high amount of chemical energy in them. It is through the breaking of the 3rd phosphate bond, as shown in this GIF here, that the energy is released. When an enzymatic reaction needs energy, it can obtain it by breaking the 3rd bond in ATP. ATP releases the energy that can be therefore used to do what we call cellular work, which means to make another chemical bond or to change the shape of a protein, etc., etc. As a result, we now understand that ATP in the biological world can be made from 2 sources, light energy, as we've just seen in plants, or from food energy, as we saw during cellular respiration. And basically what happens is that ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and phosphate are bonded together using that energy to make ATP. We can therefore imagine that there's a giant ATP cycle going on in all cells, where energy from sunlight or food is used to combine ATP and inorganic phosphate, often abbreviated as P sub I. That energy is used to make ATP, and then the energy in ATP is broken apart and is available for cellular work, to make, for example, an RNA, or to cause movement, such as by a motor protein along a piece of cytoskeleton, or gross muscular movement when an organism has to move its muscles. We also want to get an idea of what the chloroplast is like, because photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast. So the chloroplast, as I said earlier, has a very distinctive structure, and it's now time for you to learn this. It's surrounded by a double membrane, and therefore it has an intermembrane space between the inner and outer membranes. Inside these double membranes are green disc-like structures called thylakoids, and these basically act like little solar collectors. The thylakoids are stacked into structures called grana, the singular is granum, that look like a stack of green coins, and the space between the grana and inside the inner membrane is called the stroma. It's filled with a gelatinous liquid. So a lot of vocabulary here. And in the next slide, I have a quiz for you to use to try to memorize it. Here is your study guide, so you have to learn the detailed anatomy of a chloroplast, and here are the 8 terms you need to know. And then on this slide, I have a quiz, and you can take this and then click through it and find the inner membrane, the intermembrane space, the thylakoid, the granum, the stroma, the channels interconnecting the thylakoids, because I didn't mention those, but you can see that they're there. And then finally, starch grains, which we're not going to talk about much, but this is, excess energy that has been produced. It is stored in starch. And we all know what starch is, since we've all eaten rice, potatoes, and had bread made from wheat, which have all stored starch. So, that's it for today. What I hope you've gotten out of today's talk is the importance of photoautotrophs to the rest of life, that photosynthesis depends on the ability of pigments in leaves or other green parts of plants to absorb sunlight, and that pigment then is able to use the energy in the captured sunlight to create ATP, and that ATP is then able to be used to create glucose. The structure of the chloroplast is very important for understanding how this is going to occur. So it's absolutely important that you understand the anatomy of a chloroplast before we go on to tomorrow's lesson. So you have a lot to do. Until then, and after you finish studying, go outside, take a look at nature, ask biological questions, bring them back to class, and I'll see you soon.